Hey, David, how's it going?
Hey, good, thanks. How you doing, man?
Good. Happy Halloween. It is a fun time of year, specifically for my girls. It's a good time. Well, really for me too, because I get to eat their candy. But I love Halloween. This is awesome.
Yeah, yeah. What are your kids going as this year?
The almost required costume for my girls, which is going as princesses. They pretty much are princesses every year, and so this year is the exact same, just different princesses every year. So I have to buy multiple dresses, of course. What about your
Okay.
kids?
Yeah, yeah. My youngest is going as a unicorn again. She is in the unicorn phase. She wants to be a unicorn again.
That's awesome.
My oldest now is getting into Marvel movies, so she wants to be Spider Woman this year.
I love
So
that.
we'll see
Actually,
that.
here,
Yeah,
here you go. I have my Mandalorian reference shirt on. It says the
love it.
Dadalorian. So yeah, we're me and
Nice.
your daughter clearly get along. It's perfect.
I like it. I like
So
it.
it sounds like our kids are having more fun than they are necessarily trying to scare anybody, which is probably a good thing. But we wanted to change that a little, right?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, there's enough scariness out there. We don't necessarily need to bring more, but certainly I think that the scariness of Halloween transitions into the scariness of real estate because I think this is a topic that scares a lot of people, right?
Yeah, and we figured what better way to celebrate the holiday than to scare all of our audience with some scary stories, right? We were really trying to map this out and thinking about podcast topics for the quarter and for the season and said, what if we did a spooky and scary things that can happen in real estate episode? So that is what we're going to be bringing you guys today.
Yeah, and really all you have to do is mention to like three different people that you're considering investing in real estate and you'll undoubtedly get at least two of those three people to tell you scary stories of like, well, I heard that my uncle's roommate's dog watcher's cousin had this scary thing that happened in real estate investing and you shouldn't do it because it's scary. And those scary stories have a way of kind of growing a life of their own and becoming mythical and magical and to some extent that's deserved. Scary things can happen, right? Owning houses can cause headaches over time. Certainly more than maybe just buying index funds as a retirement strategy. So, there's some part of that's deserved, but there's some part of that that's probably overhyped as well.
Yeah, and just like a scary movie marathon or the classic horror flicks, they're scarier at first than I think they really need to be, and these stories are no different, right? The things that you hear about often are occurring very infrequently, or they're stories that are over exaggerated because someone didn't prepare well. So with many of the stories that we hear floating around, we thought we would go through and just really try to shine some light on what sounds like a really spooky story, but might not be the case.
Yeah, like we recently recorded episode 77, which was focusing on those figure outable problems. To quote Rachel again, like that, love that quote, those figure outable problems. And that got us thinking even more about some of these scary stories that we've heard. And we've heard these from several guests along the way. And then how those don't have to be all that scary once you break down the issue and you break down the solution. So we didn't want our own perceptions to be the only voice in that discussion, but we wanted to bring in some other past podcast guests that were willing to record a spooky story that they have from their investing and then how they got through that, got to the other side of that, and it turned out to not be quite as spooky once they turned the lights on.
Yes, a huge thank you to our contributors that sent in their spooky stories. Really appreciate it. Again, makes the podcast rather than listening to me and David all the time. So we'll start with Dylan. Dylan's been on the show before. Again, he had a terrible, awful flood happen, and we want to take you to that because, again, it's a legitimately scary story, or at least it sounds that way up front.
We owned a duplex in Cincinnati. It was a 3-bed, 2-bath on top of a 3-bed, 2-bath. The upstairs water heater ended up breaking, and the upstairs tenant did not know how to turn off the water. And my partner and I were both at the pharmacy, so we couldn't go and get over there in time. It ended up ruining the bottom unit, water damage everywhere, messed with some of the electrical, HVAC, etc. We had to find somewhere for those tenants to go in the interim while it got renovated. So that was our second investment property. So it was a little scary at times, but we ended up contacting the insurance company. The insurance company helped pay basically for the entire renovation. We were only out of pocket a couple $1,000. and ended up those other tenants from the downstairs we inherited, and they weren't their best tenants, and so we ended up re-renting that place out. It was newly renovated, brand new, and we got higher rents in the end. So I ended up in a good story, but in the meantime, it was a quite the welcome to the investment journey.
So that was definitely rough. Not only was it a huge water issue, but water mixing with electricity sounds like it's not a good thing. And then when it's so bad that tenants have to move out of the property for a stretch, like that sounds particularly scary. That sounds like one of these things that I would have heard and would have thought like, I don't know if I really want to get into this. This sounds like a mess.
And especially happened when they're in the pharmacy, busy and can't handle it. Like it just, I don't know. It sounds really scary. But again, it sounds like too, the insurance was there. And that's what it's for, right? They prepared, they did the right things up front to make sure that when these bad things do happen, they were able to file for an insurance claim. And the insurance covered what, sounded originally like a potential catastrophic situation with exactly what the insurance is intended to do.
Yeah, so definitely a huge lesson here to make sure that, catastrophic things hopefully don't happen very often at all, but there is the chance that can happen. And Murphy's Law, yes, this happened when Dylan and his partner were working in the pharmacy and couldn't jump out and handle it personally. So they needed to rely on insurance in this case because it just became a catastrophic issue. So making sure that you have insurance to protect yourself from some of these spooky, scary, potentially catastrophic situations is really important. If you need help finding an insurance agent or making sure you have the right insurance, we interviewed Brian Neal way back on episode 14, and he gives some tips on how to find an insurance agent, what kind of policies and considerations, and what that thought process is behind getting that insurance and getting that insurance right. Even one other thing, just in this market, when we've talked about market appreciation in recent years, this may be a good time if you haven't talked with your insurance agent recently, is to give them a call and say, hey, I want to make sure that I still have enough insurance. I have the right insurance based on the value of my property today. If you haven't made that adjustment after the appreciation we've seen in the last few years, you may not have the coverage you need. So it may be worth a phone call to just check in and make sure that's right.
That's a great reminder. And, one of the other things that I think it's easy to overlook, but might also be spooky to some individuals is the fact that if they're the only people that are being relied upon and they're busy, like that could create a whole different set of problems, right? And it made the current problem even worse. So it's worth considering a professional property manager. They might have been able to respond faster. They might have been able to handle some of the next steps on their behalf. There's a lot of things that the property manager could have helped with potentially that may not have seemed like important up front. And again, it's easy to handle when you're just dealing with day-to-day tenant issues. But when these big crises occur, that tenant or that property manager might be more beneficial. So there's no right or wrong answer to that, but it's just something to think about, something to consider as you ponder your investment strategy.
Yeah, and we've talked about that a few different times in different podcasts. The potential value of of having a professional property manager, the potential value of doing that yourself. I know, Nate, you kind of do both, where you manage some properties yourself and you have a property manager for others. So, that certainly is a factor and is something that you can consider. But the whole topic of property management can even create some scary situations as well. And so that really brings us to our second guest, Jared Wonders, who's been on the podcast twice now. Jared's a great guy. Let's jump to his story here.
We've certainly had quite a few stories that we can tell people from our real estate experiences, but the one that really sticks out in my mind, and one that was kind of, a little bit scary, but also ended up being one of the best decisions we ever made as far as the real estate process goes, was we had a contract with our property manager for about a year. And if we terminated the contract early, it was one of those things where we would have to pay a fee and, whatnot. But I wanted to talk to our property manager that was taking calls from our tenants. So I left her. So I called her, and come to find out, I couldn't even leave a voicemail on her voicemail list. So it was that point where I was just thinking to myself, like, if I'm not getting the customer service that they're getting, there's no way that my tenants' needs are being addressed if they even come up. So we had a couple of red flags before that experience with our property manager, but that was the last straw. And at the point where we decided to self-manage, which does take up a little more time, but honestly one of the best decisions we ever made for us, just because we do not have many properties, and it was just made it, cutting out the middleman was just a good thing for us. And now we have our own systems in place and our own contractors that can come out and deal with the situation very quickly, and I think much quicker than a property management company might be able to deal with, at least in our particular area. So it was just a very, very, very good and definitely needed change for us. We were able to take some of the changes that we made and some of the systems that we had put in place for our long-term rental directly into our short-term rental too. So just having those systems in place for us in regards to property management and self-managing for the long-term rental really helped us out, and being able to decide how to run things from a short-term rental perspective. So it gave us a lot of good insight into self-management, and again, just not looking back from the experience we had. It did actually work out that we had the property manager, because we realized that we could do as good a job or better, at least in our minds, that we thought from the property manager experience that we had. But looking forward to we realized that maybe in the future we may be out maybe trying to outsource some of that property management as we kind of move forward and start to grow our business. So. But yeah, it was a spooky experience, but glad we went through it, and we think that we're all the better for it.
And, speaking of property managers, Jared tells a scary story of a property manager that he thought would lighten his load and free up his time, like we were talking about before. But instead, it really wasn't somebody that he could entrust his investment with. So Jared, being a responsible, methodical, safety-oriented pharmacist just like us, he was able to take the challenge and honestly do a better job himself and save a lot of money in addition to that.
Yeah, and further, he was able to learn a lot about the property management side and the long-term rental side, which tends to be of the spectrum of long-term and short-term rentals. The long-term side tends to be the least labor intensive. It's a great place to start in terms of property management. But as he was able to get some experience and confidence there, that made him comfortable diving into the short-term property management, which is certainly more labor intensive, takes a lot more time and care and effort. So I know that's been an intimidating switch to a lot of investors that have thought about short-term rentals, but I know that's been an intimidating thing for me, and one thing that's kind of kept me back from doing the short-term rental side, because I recognize that that complexity and the time commitment that sits there, and that's a big factor when transitioning. But because Jared forced himself to learn and dive in, that became much less of a barrier for him, much less of a hurdle. And he was then able to dive into having multiple different investment strategies out there, and was able to do so with confidence, which is just huge.
Yeah, I completely agree. All right, I want to take you to our third former podcast guest. We've got Blake.
Happy Halloween, everybody. My name is Blake Johnson, and I've been an investor in real estate for about 6 years. And I was trying to think back on some stuff that's been, hard on us, or as you guys called spooky, since we're around the Halloween season. And one of the things that stepped out to me, now it wouldn't be that big of a deal, but at the time, we were trying to buy our fifth house, and we received an appraisal on it that was about $30,000 below what we expected it to be. And for us, that meant we were going to have to put in around $20,000 of our own money. We were a young investor, so at the time that was a lot of cash for us. And so we didn't know what to do, and we've always heard that challenging an appraiser never works out well. So we called our banker, and our banker actually worked with us and worked with the appraiser and got that adjusted. He had used an old listing, and it came back to being about $20,000 above we thought it should be worth. So it was a win for us in the end, but it was scary at the time, and we didn't know what to do. So moral of the story is, don't be afraid to challenge an appraiser, because sometimes it'll work out in your manner.
So I know we've talked with Blake in the past about some of the construction and renovation things in particular, and this wasn't that. This is one of the spooky things that can happen on the financing side of things. So Nate, with your realtor hat on, can you back us up a minute and just give us a little context for how crucial an appraisal is in the home purchase process?
Yeah, sure thing. So once an offer is written by a buyer and accepted by the seller, and after whatever negotiation needs to take place, one common contingency is that the buyer must be able to get a mortgage on the property. They have to actually be able to pay for it. We call that a financing contingency. And the mortgage company, what they're trying to do is make sure that they're not loaning more on the property than the property is actually worth. They do so by requiring an independent appraisal, usually through an outside company, where that appraiser is going to come out and they're going to evaluate the property. And so if the appraisal comes back at a value that is lower than the agreed upon purchase price, the bank can choose to not offer the mortgage. Or the buyer could try to bring up the difference, right? They could have a higher down payment so the bank loans less money, effectively putting that bank in a safer spot, right? There are some options. But if the appraisal comes in much, much lower than expected, like $30,000 in this case, the buyer might not always have the ability to bring that extra money to the table, and they might fall through, which could mean, the deal itself doesn't work out. So it's a pretty big part of the process, and one that we don't really talk about a whole lot.
Yeah, in the case of an investment property, that investor may have that extra saved, maybe, but it may not be saved for an extra down payment they weren't planning on making. So it may have been set aside for repairs or renovations, or even just as an emergency fund for that property, like we've talked about, because at some point the roof may go out, you may have sewer issues, whatever could happen. So if that's going to wipe all the savings and all the strategy that's behind there, that can be a problem. Plus, from an investment side, it's got to be discouraging to feel like you're paying $30,000 more than what an independent expert says the house is worth. Like, why would that make sense as an investor?
Yeah. Jim said something great a couple episodes back about it's the only business in the world where somebody tells you this is what it's worth. And you're like, I'm willing to pay a whole bunch more for it. Are you sure?
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
just crazy. And again, I've seen these appraisals really cause a huge problem on the investment side. If the owner occupants are paying more than appraised value, that's not uncommon. We're still seeing that even in today's market, but especially over the last year or so. But what's nice is that they're going to be in that home for a while, right? They've got time for that appreciation to catch up, and it's not usually as big of a deal. But when you're making an investment, part of the goal is to remove that emotion and just make it a math problem. And if the math is telling you it's $30,000 over the appraised value, like, what are you starting to follow? It doesn't make as much sense.
Yeah. However, all that is predicated on the assumption that the appraisal is correct. And so
Yeah.
I tend to assume that, a licensed professional appraiser, they're going to get the right answer the majority of the time. That's what they've been trained on. That's what they know how to do. And so I tend to expect that appraisers are generally right. And it sounds like Blake had that same opinion
Mhm.
of the appraiser's probably right, and challenging a professional at their own game. When I'm not a licensed appraiser, how am I going to do that and say, I think you're wrong? Like, how would that even work?
Yeah, but we've seen time and time again where, and Blake presents a really interesting case where if you dig into the data and you find a flaw in that data, generally speaking, you can make a really good case. And a good realtor can help you with this if it becomes a problem. I mean, the rule is really to use the data and follow the data, obtain comparable sales within a relatively close time range, a relatively close geographical range, and try to account for the factors that might make one property different than another. And if you balance all that out, you can really start to truly compare a property. So, for instance, a comparable sale might be geographically close, but if it's right next to busy train tracks or in a totally different school district or right next to a commercial property, those factors could all impact the value. And so, if you can look at all of those pieces objectively, you can start to build your case to really start to challenge that first inclination.
Yeah, and in this case, Blake went back through the data. Again, that requires reading that full report. These are oftentimes, 20 or more page reports, but getting into there, finding the data, finding those comps, when was it sold? And Blake mentioned that the comparable sale was really, really old. And so particularly in this market, we've seen all kinds of value fluctuation over the last couple of years, by much greater magnitude of fluctuation than we would expect in more of a typical market season. So by citing that age and challenging that data and asking for the reconsideration, the appraiser swapped that out, used a different comparable sale, and that completely changed the math. And that was very helpful in changing the value to a number that made the investment make sense again.
Yeah, and I think I'm at a pretty 50-50 split on success with this. I don't often see appraisal challenges working out, especially if somebody is just unhappy with the value. It has to be data driven. And even sometimes when I know the data supports it, it still doesn't change the appraiser's value. So it's a hard game.
Yeah. And I think even your 50-50 example speaks to the fact that this challenging an appraisal isn't something that happens on every deal. This isn't
No,
like a
definitely not.
routine part of the process. This is a pretty rare thing. One situation that happened to me was I had an appraisal come back one time, lower than expected on a single family home that we had renovated. And when I went through the report and I looked at what the appraiser had used as comparables, there was one house on the list that stuck out with a value lower than the others. So that caused me to check that house out. I pulled up the address. I looked at the pictures online. And when I looked at the listing photos online, I realized this is one that I had looked at when it was on the market, and I didn't want to make an offer on it because it needed so much work. It was like down to the studs, already demoed, like in really bad shape, and that was used as a comparable for this renovated house. So, I'm assuming that the appraiser was doing multiple things at once, and just had this in the wrong stack, and so certainly like mistakes happen, right? Like that happens to everybody. So we were able to. I messaged the lender, and the lender and I pointed that out, and it did result in a similar process. So it certainly can happen, but I've had many more appraisals that have been right than have been wrong. This is a pretty obscure thing, and challenging it doesn't happen every day. But yes, it is all about data and all about math, exactly like you're saying.
Yeah, and like you mentioned, those egregious, very obvious issues, those are the ones where you're more likely to win your case and get that remedy. Someone deciding that a house is condition 3 instead of condition 4, which if you've read any appraisal reports, you'll understand what I'm talking about, or condition 4 versus condition 3. Those are harder to challenge, right? Some of that is truly subjective from the appraisal, and it makes it difficult.
Yeah, and that's different than like a school district boundary, or
Yep.
again, some of those just very objective things, the date of the sale or the distance from the property being appraised. Those objective things are much easier to discuss than, well, I thought this house was pretty good looking. I didn't think it was that bad. Like those kind of things really weaken your argument a lot.
Agreed. Yeah.
Yeah. So with those 3 spooky stories, I'm hopeful that these investors' successes in moving through that horror story and getting to the other side of it can make it seem less spooky, that a lot of these are figure outable problems. And I also want to give a huge thank you to these former podcast guests who recorded their spooky story. As a sign of appreciation, each person that recorded their story is going to get a super comfy YFP t-shirt sent to them in the mail. So again, we appreciate you all.
Yeah, we seriously do. And we hope that we've made some spooky horror stories a little less scary for you on this Halloween. And you're ready to start your investing journey despite all of the spookiness out there. So have a great week and a happy Halloween.
Thanks for listening to the YFP Real Estate Investing Podcast. If you like what you heard on today's show, please leave us a review and subscribe to the show so you never miss an episode. If you have a question, know someone that would make a good guest, or want to connect with Nate or David, head on over to yfprealestate.com and join the growing YFP Real Estate Investing Facebook group. As we conclude this week's episode of the YFP Real Estate Investing Podcast, an important reminder that the content in this podcast is provided to you for your informational purposes only and is not intended to provide and should not be relied on for investment or any other advice. Information in the podcast and corresponding materials should not be construed as a solicitation or offer to buy or sell any investment or related financial products. We urge listeners to consult with a financial advisor with respect to any investment. Furthermore, the information contained in our archived newsletters, blog posts, and podcasts is not updated and may not be accurate at the time you listen to it on this podcast. Opinions and analyses expressed herein are solely those of your financial pharmacist, unless otherwise noted, and constitute judgments as of the dates published. Such information may contain forward-looking statements which are not intended to be guarantees of future events. Actual results could differ materially from those anticipated in the forward-looking statements. For more information, please visit yourfinancialpharmacist.com/disclaimer. Thank you for your support of the YFP Real Estate Investing Podcast. Have a great rest of your week.